Darci will be the moderator of our great panel discussion on the small business case for voting rights, the current status on legislation in the Senate, and the history of the filibuster and recommendations for change. This part of the program is being recorded and will be made available to the media and public. Darci?
Frank, thank you so much for having me here today to serve as the moderator. I am honored and humbled to be a small part of a very important forum that we're about to start. If we were in person, I would tell everyone, please stand to your feet and give Congressman Clyburn a round of applause. I feel like every time I get a chance to hear him speak about voting right legislation, it is a master class and everything we should know up to date about civil rights, about voting, and about what it really means to be an American and advocating for those who don't have a voice. So for each one of you who sit on this panel today on the national platform, you are the voice for small business owners. And so I'm excited to hear what you have to say about what we've already heard and moving forward, what voting rights mean to small business owners. So by way of introduction, if it's okay with you, Frank, I will just give a quick bio, a one-liner to introduce each of our panelists. And from there, we'll start and hear from each of them in the order that they are outlined. So we're going to start with a quick introduction of Vernita Naylor, owner of Jabez Enterprise Group, small business majority council member. After Vernita, oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I started with Vernita. I should have started with Natasha. My apologies, Natasha. So we're going to start with Natasha McKeller Crosby, real estate agent, Main Street Alliance board member. Then we'll go to Vernita. And then we'll hear from Thomas Oppel, executive vice president of American Sustainable Business Council. After Thomas, Ashleigh Wilson, the legislative director and counsel to Majority Whip James Clyburn, is going to be our next speaker. And then we'll wrap things up with Mel Barnes, staff counsel for Law Forward and co-author of Filibuster Reform is Coming. Here's How: 7 Ideas for Change. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to open the floor for questions. We're working with a little bit of budgeted time on my end. For those of you who are not in Columbia, South Carolina, or in the Midlands, I'm a journalist here at WLTX News 19, which is the CBS affiliate in Columbia, South Carolina, and I have to be on air at 5 o'clock. So I'm gonna hang out with you guys as long as possible, but I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say, and we are going to begin with Natasha.
Thank you, Darci. I am Natasha McKeller Crosby from the great Commonwealth of Virginia, which just today removed a monument to one of the most impactful voter intimidation campaigns in this country, the Lost Cause, while also being the only state in the South to enact voting rights legislation that increases access instead of denying it. I appreciate the opportunity to join this important discussion on behalf of Main Street Alliance, a national network of small businesses that prioritizes economic investment in our businesses, our employees, our customers, and our communities. On behalf of MSA and our members, we want to applaud and thank Representative Clyburn for all of his efforts to secure and protect our democracy. As you may know, Main Street Alliance works to organize small business owners and support them across key issues like capital access, tax fairness, anti-monopoly, care economy, and racial justice. But we can't do any of this without a strong democratic process. Small businesses are bearing the brunt of corporate influence in this country. We saw another clear illustration of this during the pandemic when COVID relief programs were pried open to large chains, pushing small businesses to the back of the line or even shutting them out completely. From consolidation to monopolization to Amazon and other giant corporations not paying their fair share of taxes. Special interests in politics are exacerbating inequality and hamstringing policies that would actually support our communities and our customers. By continuing to pour outsized money into politics, America's largest corporations have used the decade since the Supreme Court's disastrous Citizens United decision to create a stranglehold on the election cycle. To reform our democracy, election security and money in politics should absolutely be seen as small business issues. Like working people generally, many small business owners understand that economic power and political power go hand in hand. With millions of dollars spent on lobbyists and corporate concentration on the rise, small businesses and their communities who can and shouldn't afford to hire lobbyists need reforms as a political counterweight to large corporations and the very wealthy. These lobbying pressures have created an economy that extracts from its communities in the form of corporations offering low-paying jobs and gig work with no benefits, and paying less and less in taxes that would support the very communities where they reap their profits. Businesses crave predictability and certainty in the same way Americans want to prevent vulnerable, crumbling democracies. We must fix our broken campaign finance system to ensure that our representatives listen to every American, not just the rich and powerful. We need a government that actually works by and for working people and small business owners of all races, all genders, abilities, and places of origin. Without reforms, small businesses that believe in an alternative vision of local investment will be drowned out by the sea of corporate lobbying money. We must seize this opportunity to finally pass bold, comprehensive reforms that fix our political system and secure us from undue influence, whether foreign interference or excessive domestic corporate money. Now, thanks to Representative Clyburn's strong leadership, the House has already taken critical action to repairing democracy by passing the For the People Act, H.R. 1, which provides essential solutions to limit money in politics, ban gerrymandering, and address ethics abuses and voting rights barriers. All measures needed to repair our currently broken democracy. And just last month, the House passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, H.R. 4, which codifies essential voting rights. As we look to preserve and strengthen our democracy, a minority of senators should not have the ability to block legislation that would stop political corruption, protect the right to vote, or prevent politicians from partisan or racist gerrymandering. Main Street Alliance supports rule changes that carve democracy reform bills out from the Senate filibuster and allow them to be debated and moved to a simple majority vote. With pro-voter reforms now leading our country, we have an important opportunity to transform our political system into one that realizes the true promise of democracy, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you.
Hi, I'm sorry, Darci, go ahead.
Right ahead. If everyone can go in the order that we've outlined, I will step out of the way and we can keep going.
We're trying to get you to that 5 o'clock. Hi, my name is Vernita Naylor, and I thank you for this opportunity. I'm an author, small business owner, advocate, and educator, as well as a small business ambassador. And I feel especially motivated to protect the rights of small business owners who are already struggling to recover from the pandemic and are now facing the setbacks due to the surge of the new variants and must continue to shelter in place. Minority women and unresourced businesses experience the brunt of challenges fueled by extreme inequalities. For example, tax policies, healthcare, government contracting opportunities, and access to capital, including PPP funding. Small businesses are the channels for creating jobs that are beneficial for America's economy. The voting booth is a platform where the disadvantaged and under-resourced have a voice and deserve to be heard without any obstructions, but are muted by the recent proposed voting laws that is widening the gap between the have and have-nots. From January to July this year, at least 18 states, including where I currently reside in Georgia, laws are approximately 30 restricted laws have adversely affect the livelihood of small businesses. The new voting laws in Georgia, spearheaded by our current governor, were allegedly enacted based upon the allegations of voter fraud, instead of accepting that the people here and throughout the US spoke and elected those who are in office. Here are a few laws that impact the Georgia voters. First, shortening the window to apply and deliver mail-in ballots. We are unable to vote against laws and policies that's against big business and the wealthy who receive support and access to more significant resources through tax loopholes and political connections, while the small businesses continue to struggle to stay afloat with limited or no staffing. The second, reducing the availability, location, and hours of polling places, including drop-off boxes for mail-in ballots, will cause inconvenience for small business owners who have to stand in long lines or traveling long distances to polling places. This tactic causes hardships and greatly impacts the business's bottom line. And lastly, the law banning snacks and waters to voters waiting in line has been established with laws that are clearly not defined. It appears that a voter standing in line can call Uber Eats with no consequences, but those small businesses that may want to provide food and water to those in line could be found guilty and charged with a misdemeanor due to the appearance of allegedly soliciting votes. History reflects that to enforce these suppressive laws, there will be an abundance of law enforcement at specific and targeted locations, which adds yet another level of obstruction. Small business owners share a concern that government doesn't pay enough attention to their needs. We have witnessed government officials either being too influenced by small interests, the wealthy, and big businesses. We are aware that this country has a volatile history of restricting freedoms for targeted and specific groups. We must propose by removing any barriers that create disparities in access to information and support knowledge sharing, creating space for entrepreneurs to grow, thrive, and know that they are genuinely part of democracy by allowing us to voice our collective consciousness in safe and inclusive space. Georgia small business owners have had the opportunity to pursue the American dream, but this dream cannot continue to exist for everyone unless all citizens can participate in the election process without any barriers. Suppressing the voting power of our state's small businesses that are bringing in jobs, improving the economy, and enhancing our communities is like a slap in the face. Our democracy is strongest when all Americans have fair access to voting and support to ensure voting rights for every American, regardless of race, gender, and socioeconomic status. This should include reinstating the key provisions of the Voting Rights Act and creating a carve-out to get voting rights passed in the Senate. The efforts that currently threaten voting rights are unjust, and we must continue to speak loudly and strategically above the political theatrics and push back on horrible laws that do not center on equality, inclusivity, democracy, and entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thanks, Vernita. I'm Thomas Oppel. I'm the Executive Vice President of the American Sustainable Business Council. We're a network of about 250,000 businesses who reject the idea that share price is the only mission of business. We believe in a stakeholder economy that works for owners and employees, their families, their communities, and the world, because, as the saying goes, there are no jobs on a dead planet. And just as business and the environment are linked, so are business and free markets linked to democracy. Democracy is all about who sets the rules and how those rules are applied. Now, we all know that the goal, the aspiration of the United States has always been for fair and uniform application of those laws. We've fallen short the entire history, but at least we're trying to head in the right direction, hopefully. But in countries that are less democratic or even authoritarian, instead of the rules being for business about whether you're offering the best product or the best price, the question becomes whether you're the best friend of the people in power, the people who make the rules. That's not what we need here in the United States. And frankly, we've seen it all too often. That's why we need For the People and the John Lewis bill and the Clyburn carve-out. The real problem in the United States has never been that people who should not be voting are casting a ballot. The real problem is that people who should be voting aren't participating enough. Every study has shown that real voter fraud is a minute problem. It's 0.0000 on and on and on. Every court, every election official, even the Republican appointed to protect voter systems from digitally hacking, declared the 2020 elections absolutely fair and the safest in our history, perhaps. And despite record participation in 2020, record participation, everyone talks about how great the participation was in 2020. Only 61% of eligible voters nationwide cast a presidential ballot. And that's the highest percentage, 61%. That's the highest percentage in any presidential election, going all the way back to 1976, more than 50 years. And it's worse than ironic that the very people who are supporting efforts to suppress voters point to that record of participation as somehow an indication that voter suppression isn't a real problem. But the very changes that created that high participation in 2020 are the chief targets of voter suppression. And the two speakers ahead of me spoke about these: early voting, weekend voting, drive-up voting, mail-in voting, even denying the ability of people standing in line the opportunity to get a cup of water. So here's the business school analogy that I've come up with. In business today, in retail business today, studies show that shoplifting is responsible for an impact of about 1% of sales. Now that's a far bigger problem than voter fraud, far bigger than voter fraud, but it's 1%. It's really a tiny problem. And to deal with shoplifting, retailers don't cut the hours their stores are open or make parking harder or put armed guards in front of every good that they're offering. You take reasonable precautions, but you don't make it harder for your customers to come in and shop and feel comfortable doing so. Now imagine a retailer finds out that 25 to 33%, a quarter to a third of their potential customer base simply weren't coming in to shop. What would they do? I don't think they'd make it harder. I don't think they'd start cutting down the hours they were open. They'd increase their advertising, they'd discount prices, they'd open more hours, they'd expand parking, they'd offer free coffee and snacks, just like the banks are doing these days. Business owners would make it easier, not harder, to bring in customers. And that's exactly the solution we need for voting. We need to make it easier for all of those eligible voters who aren't participating today, for whatever reason. We make it easier for them to participate and to feel like their votes count and will be counted. And that's why ASBC, with our colleagues at Main Street Alliance and Small Business Majority and responsible business organizations and business owners that you've heard from and across this country, are supporting the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the For the People Act, and a carve-out for constitutional issues of Senate filibuster. And we do like to call it the Clyburn carve-out. Thanks, and I guess I'll turn it over to Ashleigh.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Ashleigh Wilson, and I am Mr. Clyburn's Legislative Director and Counsel here in DC. Mr. Clyburn is my congressman, so I'm happy to serve alongside with him every day. I'm just here to provide a just brief update and just a little additional background information on just what's happened thus far in Congress on the issue of voting rights. I'm happy to be preceded by a very well-informed crowd. So you guys stole a little bit of my thunder, but I'll try to give a little bit more to keep our audience engaged. So primarily here in Washington, Congress has looked at the issue of voting rights this year from the standpoint of two key pieces of legislation, what we're calling HR 1, which is the For the People Act, and then HR 4, which is called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021. So I'll start with HR 1. HR 1, which was passed through the House on March 3rd, is a just broad sweeping effort to make it easier to vote in federal elections. It also has provisions that end congressional gerrymandering, overhaul federal campaign finance laws, increase safeguards against foreign interference in our voting systems, strengthen government ethics rules, modernize the voter registration process. It has kind of a automatic registration provision, among many other things. So I look at the lens of HR1 from the standpoint of what can we do to make it easier and to modernize our federal voting system for all Americans. The second piece of legislation, which is HR4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021. Oh, one thing about HR1 passed the House on March 3rd. So when we're thinking about this, and we'll circle back to this, we have to remember that in America, we have a 2-branch Congress. And so in order for a bill to become a law, it has to be passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the president. So we have to remember all those steps. So sometimes we hear like, oh, this passed Congress. And I'm like, it passed the House, but we got our friends in the Senate to deal with. So that's a part of this conversation as well. But back to the HR4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which was named after voting and civil rights just giant and statesman, Congressman John Lewis of Georgia. And the purpose of HR4 is to restore key protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that were gutted by the United States Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, and more recently in the 2021 decision of Brnovich versus the DNC. My boss stole a little bit of my legal eagle thunder on this one, but by way of background, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ensured equal access to the ballot box for Black and minority voters by requiring states and localities with a certain history of discrimination in the voting space, as defined in this same piece of legislation in Section 4, to obtain a pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before making changes to their voting laws. And so essentially, if a state decided that they wanted to make some adjustments or in ways that would implicate that they were trying to limit access to the ballot, then they would have to go through the Department of Justice, who would conduct an investigation and a review of the proposed bill or proposed method to determine whether or not it would be discriminatory. And so Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlined all of the rules and parameters for that. And so then we have the Supreme Court come along in Shelby County in Brnovich, and both of those cases essentially gutted the teeth of Section 4 and its provisions. And so the goal of HR 4 is to establish new criteria for determining which states and political subdivisions must obtain pre-clearance before making changes to their voting practices and those changes going into effect. One interesting kind of tidbit about the process, the legislative process for HR 4, is that prior to the introduction of this legislation, we have 2 committees here in the House that kind of have elections and voting rights under their jurisdiction, and that's the House Committee on Administration, its Subcommittee on Elections, and then we have the House Committee on the Judiciary. And so both of those committees kind of over the last year conducted a months-long investigation and a series of hearings around the country to basically assess the status of voting rights in America, because as Mr. Clyburn mentioned, the courts in Shelby County and Brnovich, they're kind of the leg of their stool about not having, pre-clearance not being a necessity is like, oh, that's old news. We don't need to do that anymore. And so it was really interesting. I found that the House Subcommittee on Elections, they actually kind of they just released a report early this month that kind of outlined what they found in their hearings. So this is a report that was released in August of 2021. And this is I'm just going to give you kind of a brief rundown of the things that this report indicated. It indicated, one, that there was significant evidence of discriminatory impact in 6 areas: voter list maintenance and discriminatory voter purges, voter identification and documentary proof of citizenship requirements, lack of access to multilingual voting materials and language assistance at the ballot, polling place closures, consolidations, reductions in long wait times, restrictions on additional opportunities to vote, and changes to methods of election, jurisdictional boundaries, and redistricting practices. So we hear all the time, I think Tom gave us a great rundown of we don't have evidence of fraud in our American elections, but now we know from these series of hearings and this investigation that efforts are still out there to limit access to the ballot for Americans. So this legislation is very much a necessity. And so we know that we need to do this. We can all read in the headlines that in what we're experiencing now in this time is one of the most coordinated state level efforts to restrict the right to vote in our country in generations. And so we know the importance of this work and the importance of these two pieces of legislation. HR 4 passed the House in August 24th, 2021. So we just returned back from our August recess for a couple days to get this taken care of. So that has also been sent to the House. So next steps and kind of moving forward, where we are in the Senate, because both of these bills have passed the House. And so we sent it over to our friends in the Senate, and you'll hear a little bit more about the filibuster and how that kind of impedes our ability to get things done collectively as a Congress with both houses. So in the Senate, the companion to HR 1, the For the People Act is called S, which stands for Senate, right? And its bill number is 2093. So the Senate version basically tracks and mirrors the language and the provisions of the House version. And if you recall, back in late June, the Senate voted on this bill, and it was blocked by Senate Republicans because it needed a 60 vote number to pass. More recently, the House also sent over HR 4 to the Senate, but they haven't yet had the opportunity to take it over because we just came back to do it pretty recently. So it's just our understanding on the House side that the Senate will again take up S 2093, the For the People Act of 2021, the week of September 20th. So by then, us in the House and our friends in the Senate will both have returned back from the August recess. And so, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has indicated that voting rights is a priority for him in the Senate this Congress. So we're hopeful on that. And I think going forward, it's critical that we both get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act passed, because they both include key provisions that will, I think, protect and continue to preserve our democracy for generations to come. I think that you all have heard from the person who has the clearest crystal ball with regard to whether or not these bills will actually pass in the Senate this Congress. But I think that we're really hopeful that we'll be able to get this completed and accomplished this Congress, because it's just very critical. And we also, I think, have a really good understanding of what our roadblocks are going ahead. So that's important. And just lastly, with regard to the business community's part in this, I think that the business community is just in a great position to really help advocate on behalf of voting rights. Small businesses in particular, because small business touch every aspect of American life, and access to the ballot box is a fundamental right to our democracy, and it's the cornerstone of many of the other freedoms that we enjoy as Americans. So no pressure to the business community, but we need your help on this one. And also, full voter engagement in our community, in our country, means that we are building a democracy that is responsive to all of our citizens' needs. And so we've seen from the 2020 election, which featured historic levels of voter turnout. So we know that your customers, the people that small businesses serve in their local communities, are interested in the issue of voting rights and having access to the ballot. It also, access to the ballot and having just preserving our American voting rights also equally impacts us on a state and a local level. So where many small businesses do business. So, we kind of in Washington, I get the luxury of being Mr. Clyburn's legislative director. So I have my kind of hand, one foot in South Carolina and understanding what's going on there, and one foot in Washington. But sometimes where we need most boots on the ground are at the local level. And we see that from the legislation that's passed thus far in states across the country. So that's another reason why we need the help of the small business community. And lastly, we think about voting rights sometimes in the context of like, this is our fundamental constitutional right, but I think we also have to think about access to the political process and the ability to participate in the political process as being parallel and equally part important to being able to have access to being able to participate in our economy. And so I think that as we look at the needs of small business owners and small business customers, just recognizing that having the ability to participate in the democratic process and having a say in how America is shaped going into the future is really important. I just will close with just that we've heard today about the urgency of this issue and how important it is for the America and the democracy that we want to preserve and also make better every day. So I am just very excited to know that small business community is really engaged on this issue and is standing with us. So in next steps, just keep staying engaged with your members of Congress, engage with their state legislators. Also, just stay informed. And I think you're halfway there by listening to this great program. So thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Ashleigh. It's such a pleasure to hear from you and to have your office invest so much time in this panel today. My name is Mel Barnes, and I'm a lawyer with Law Forward. We are a nonprofit law firm focused on protecting and advancing democracy. I'm in Wisconsin, but we also do work nationally. And the reason I'm here to talk about the filibuster today is because the filibuster is the thing that stands in the way of voting rights legislation getting done right now. National legislation that would set a floor for how accessible voting has to be and how much access people have to the ballot box across the states. And the filibuster stops a lot of legislation from advancing, probably a lot of other policy areas that you care about as small business owners and that impact your everyday life. But this one particular area of policy, shoring up our very democracy itself, has the potential to have a real domino effect. If more people are able to vote, our elected representatives should reflect more of us and engage with us more at the state and national level. So filibuster reform on voting rights as the key to our democracy is the most important first domino to make sure that our government and our democracy works and serves the people. And the voting rights aspect of filibuster reform is the subject of a new report that will be soon published by the Brookings Institution that I've worked on with some really brilliant co-authors, including my colleague at Law Forward, Jeff Mandel, as well as Norm Eisen and Norm Ornstein. And we've proposed our own suggestion for filibuster reform, which I'll speak about a little bit today, that we call democracy reconciliation, leaning on that word reconciliation that the congressman was so focused on as well, and I think is really the key to this. And we've drawn on the concept of budget reconciliation, which offers a pathway to passing legislation to fund our government by a simple majority. Because making our democracy work, a government by and of and for the people, is just as crucial as funding our nation and making sure that the country's debts get paid. So I'll start with just a little bit of history on the filibuster and where it comes from, although others have done a really good job covering a lot of that too. But I want to kind of lead us to how it ended up working the way that it does today. So the history of the filibuster, as the congressman mentioned, is deeply rooted in racism from Calhoun to Strom Thurmond. The honing of the filibuster as a tool to prop up white supremacy in this country runs deep. Almost half of or maybe over half of the bills that have been filibustered in this country related to civil rights era legislation and reform. And those are really just the ones where we have recorded filibusters. Threats to filibuster these bills are also shaping legislation in our country throughout our history. So the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It's something that has changed over time. It's evolved a lot in recent decades and really since its invention. So a further step in that evolution now, including carving out a pathway for voting rights legislation, would be in line with that history of evolution. We've had major reform in the 70s, more recently with judicial confirmation. And the truth is there are at least 160 pathways out there where limited types of legislation can proceed to a vote with simple majority support. So I just say that to emphasize filibuster reform for democracy and voting rights legislation is not actually that radical of an idea, and it is very achievable. The current filibuster as it operates now would be completely foreign to the framers of the Constitution. They had actually experimented with supermajority requirements for legislation in the Articles of Confederation and found them very frustrating. There are some really direct founding father quotes on this, including Hamilton and Madison talking about the fact that If we allow the majority to have a veto over the majority of the people, then anytime an active step is needed to advance our country, the government will be frustrated and the people will be frustrated. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. We need an active step. We need to not just stop things from happening, but we need to shore up voting rights legislation at the national level to stop some of the restrictions that are happening at the state level. So the filibuster really came to be through a mistake. The House and the Senate started out with basically the same rules and procedures. But in the early 1800s, Aaron Burr proposed cleaning up the Senate rulebook and removing some unused procedural tools, including a rule for calling of the previous question, which is what they called this tool to end debate and move on to a vote. It wasn't really used at the time, so no one thought twice about eliminating it. And even after it was eliminated, it took the Senate a little while to realize kind of what this meant and how they could now hold up legislation. So we really didn't see the first filibusters or things that we would consider filibusters until the late 1830s, early 1940s. And then when we do, the real popularization of this tool is tied to Calhoun and others trying to prop up the economic power of the South, really foreshadowing the use of the filibuster to block civil rights long after a majority of the country and a majority of folks in the Senate supported things like ending the poll tax, anti-lynching laws. These are things that had public support that were then held up because of this filibuster tool. So let's talk about ways that we could reform the filibuster now, because that's what we want to do, right? We want to move forward. And there are a lot of options out there that have been floated by people who, either are in Congress themselves or have studied this institution for a long time. And I'm just going to recap a few of them before I talk about democracy reconciliation, which is kind of our suggestion for moving forward. So some of you might not really know what a filibuster looks like these days, because for the most part, filibusters now happen in silent. You don't see senators talking on the floor. That's no longer required. So one idea for reform is a return to the talking filibuster. This would take people back, or take us all back to what many people picture when they think of the term. If you've seen the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, it's that. It's someone holding the floor. You have to talk to hold up the vote, whether it's really true debate and voicing your policy reasons for opposition to a bill, or reading names from a phone book. You at least have to stand there and talk. So we could bring back the talking filibuster. There are some downsides to that, however. It would mean that we would have to get rid of what's called this two-track process in the Senate. And it means that filibustering would hold up not only the bill that a senator is filibustering, but also all other business before Congress. And we know that our government has a lot of important business to get done, including confirming appointments and advancing other legislation. It's also a little hard to gauge how effective this reform would be in the modern era. We could have senators coordinating a tag team effort. They'd be required to undertake some logistics, but not necessarily hold the floor for more than, say, even an hour before yielding to the next member of their minority who would take up the talking filibuster. So, on many bills, this kind of inconvenience of coordinating this effort might be enough to stop a filibuster, but on the issues that we're talking about now, voting rights legislation and reform, it's probably not enough to deter an effective filibuster where senators are still blocking this legislation. So let's talk about another option, which is really transferring the burden of a filibuster from the majority party to overcome it to the minority. So this would look like keeping the filibuster in place, even keeping the Senate on a multi-track floor schedule, but shifting the burden for a cloture vote to the minority. In other words, they would have to muster 41 votes to keep the filibuster going, instead of 60 votes by the majority to overcome it. So even though this wouldn't require a performance on the Senate floor, a call to end the debate on a particular bill would succeed if at any time there weren't 41 votes there to sustain the filibuster. So votes could be called repeatedly and we could chip away at that minority faction. but still minority control for sure. So how about a different option? The Senate could adopt an approach of ratcheting down the number of votes that can hold up a bill, creating a diminishing threshold for cloture so that each successive vote on the same individual piece of legislation would require fewer and fewer votes over a simple majority to pass. So this is the benefit, as defenders of the filibuster would say, of still allowing for a lot of debate, still providing some breaks on fast-moving legislation without being the total brick wall that the current filibuster is, preventing the passage of bills. Senator Tom Harkin has introduced a version of this reform repeatedly, and he's supported it from the majority and the minority caucus, so he gets credit for that, certainly. In 2009, he said, "We've entered a new era here of outright stoppage at all costs." And I don't think anyone can seriously argue that things have gotten better in the Senate with gridlock since 2009. So I think it's a really, really apt comparison and description of what we are experiencing now. We could transition to counting votes for sustaining a filibuster as a percentage of the members of the Senate that are present and voting, meaning if you want to hold up the bill, the least you have to do is show up and actually vote to sustain a filibuster. You can't do it from the comfort of your home. And there are other options as well. But I want to just touch very briefly on what we think, my co-authors and I think, is the best path forward that we've called democracy reconciliation. So democracy reconciliation, in short, would remove the current supermajority requirement for legislation addressing election issues fundamental to the structure of American democracy, voting rights, election administration, and redistricting. But it would keep the supermajority threshold in place for other pieces of legislation. So there are two mechanisms for enacting this filibuster reform. One that I should mention is Congress could pass a law that creates a pathway like this. That's how budget reconciliation was originally created. But we know that that's not very likely with the current Congress. Filibuster reform itself would be filibustered. So we know that this reform needs to proceed through a ruling on the scope and applicability of Senate rules, which sounds very complicated, and the structure of the votes to create new Senate precedent is indeed something that others know so much more than me about, that I've learned a lot about in writing this report. But the easiest thing to think about is what has happened with appointments of, or confirmation votes on judges and then Supreme Court justices. So if you've heard the term going nuclear, that is what creating new Senate precedent looks like. Instead of creating a new law, this means that a simple majority in practice could sustain a ruling by the Senate's presiding officer that the cloture rules do not apply to votes on core democracy issues. So that could create this whole new pathway going forward. Now, I should flag briefly, once we have the pathway, there's of course some risk that this could be used to restrict voting rights or democracy issues. We know that now Congress could use this pathway to advance voting rights, open up access to the polls. But of course, once the pathway exists, a different narrow majority in Congress could choose to do something else with it, including something like enacting national federal voter ID requirements or a prohibition on voting by mail. What I will say to that is, while these risks shouldn't be ignored, they shouldn't be overstated either. Americans are very proud of and invested in our democracy. And once the people have something that they realize is so valuable, it is very difficult to roll that back and take it away from them at a national level. I know that we're fighting against a lot of rollbacks of voting rights right now across the states, but I really think that this reform would open the door to this as a sustained positive right for Americans, and that we shouldn't be so hung up on the risks of future Congresses that we fail to take advantage of the moment that we're in right now and push forward with democracy reconciliation. That's all I have, so I will turn it back to Darci and the team. Thank you so much for having me.
Mel, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And a huge thank you to each and every one of our panelists. The information that you have provided us today it's been incredible. And because you all have given us so much information. We have a number of questions that have now popped up. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to toss the first question out to Ashleigh, and then I'm going to leave, get ready for this 5 o'clock newscast, and Frank is going to take over from there. But I appreciate you all again allowing me to be a part of this event today. I am so excited as a journalist and as a citizen to be able to share this information with our viewers. So with that being said, Ashleigh, here is the question that's been posed in the room. How can small business owners help voice support for voting rights legislation?
Sure, I'm happy to tell you, as a person who gets a lot of incoming from advocates on every issue you ever thought of, happy to tell you how I think small business can be most effective on the issue of voting rights. Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. Literally let your voice be heard. Any public official or a member of Congress, a member of your state, local legislature, any way that you can publicly advocate for these pieces of voting rights legislation, I think is super critical. And I mean, whether that's writing an op-ed in your local newspaper, just anything you can think of that would kind of remind us of the importance of this issue and its urgency in our democracy, I think is really important. I get a lot of incoming from our small business community in South Carolina on just about any topic. And I will say, most of us, we want to hear from the people in our congressional districts. So if you have a member, I mean, every state has a member of Congress. So if you reach out to their office, schedule a meeting, tell them you're a business person and you have some issues, I think it's great that this particular program is being put on by so many different groups. Several of them I've had pretty good contact with and hearing, always been a good advocate for the small business community. So I feel pretty aware of the issues that are affecting small businesses. And so for people like me and people in Washington and people in your local state houses to hear more and to hear from local businesses on and issues that are important to them that may be outside of the direct needs of your small business, I think is just really important. And also just staying informed and just trying to do your best to stay informed by tracking the process. And so I'll tell you one nerd and interesting thing that I always like to tell people who come and talk and advocate to me about different types of things is one way to stay informed, particularly about what's happening here in Washington, is just to track the bill on congress.gov. So every piece of legislation that's introduced in Congress, the U.S. Congress has a page on congress.gov. And so go there, type in the bill number. It's pretty simple. You don't even have to type in the bill number. You can type in the name of the piece of legislation. You can search by the person or the member of Congress who introduced it. So you can go on congress.gov and look up every bill that Mr. Clyburn has ever introduced in his whole entire time in Congress. So that's one way. I also recommend looking up Congressional Research Service reports on any particular issue that is important to you or important to your business, whether that's the miscellaneous tariffs bill, whether it's voting rights that you want to become more informed on, consider going to the Congressional Research Service's public webpage, because they do regular reports that are updated pretty regularly on just about any issue affecting life in America, and also just American government. So just about most major big bills, there's a pretty well written and easy to understand summary on those pieces of legislation. So I'm just a big nerd. So I just love going there. Anytime I want to learn something new, a new issue that's come up, that's the first place I go to kind of be informed. So I think that equally small business owners can do the same thing. So those are my thoughts on how small business can best be engaged on this issue. And we welcome it here in Washington.
Thank you so much, Ashleigh. We do appreciate that. And I want to thank Darci, even though she's had to go get ready for her 5 o'clock newscast for moderating the roundtable. In only a few days, the future of our country's democracy and our entrepreneurial economy will be decided. You have a big stake in the outcome. Get involved. Let your senator know how you feel about the issue and legislation. Protect democracy, or you won't have it. Thank you very much for participating, and we will be making this webinar roundtable available. In a few minutes, we'll probably send you a copy. So thank you all very much, and do get involved. Let your senator know what's going on. Thank you very much.